In the winter of 1944, as snow began to settle across the forests of the Ardennes, Germany prepared for one final gamble that could change the course of the war. By this point, the Third Reich was collapsing on multiple fronts. In the east, the Soviet army was pushing relentlessly toward Germany itself. In the west, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were advancing across France and Belgium. Yet in the headquarters of Adolf Hitler, there remained a belief that a bold and unexpected strike could reverse everything. Hitler's plan was breathtaking in both ambition and desperation. German armored armies would launch a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, a rugged region of hills, thick woods, and narrow roads that had already played a role in the German victory of 1940. The goal was simple but audacious: split the Allied front, push west through Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and capture the critical port of Antwerp. If successful, the offensive would divide British and American forces, disrupt Allied supply lines, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. The operation would later become known as the Battle of the Bulge, but at the time the Germans called it Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. The name itself was meant to deceive Allied intelligence into thinking Germany was preparing for a defensive operation rather than an offensive one. German commanders understood that success depended on speed. Every unit involved in the attack received strict timetables. Panzer divisions had to move rapidly along narrow forest roads, capturing key towns and road junctions before the Allies could react. If even one important crossroads remained in American hands for too long, traffic jams would form, fuel supplies would fall behind, and the entire operation could begin to unravel. Senior German officers such as Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model studied the maps carefully. Their armored columns would need to pass through a series of small Belgian towns that controlled the region's road network. Among those towns was a place that barely stood out on most strategic maps. The town was St. Vith. At first glance, St. Vith looked insignificant. It was a small Belgian town with a population of only a few thousand people. Yet its location made it one of the most important road junctions in the entire Ardennes region. Several major roads intersected there, forming a hub that German armored units would need in order to continue their advance toward the Meuse River. German planners assumed the town would fall quickly. American forces in the area were believed to be inexperienced and scattered. Intelligence suggested that the sector was thinly defended, with units resting after months of fighting across Europe. Many German officers believed the Americans would collapse under the weight of the surprise attack. But war has a way of disrupting even the most carefully designed plans. Throughout November and early December of 1944, German forces quietly assembled along the front line. Troops moved mostly at night to avoid Allied aircraft. Tanks were hidden beneath camouflage nets in forests. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Entire armored divisions waited in freezing temperatures for the order to move. Secrecy was so effective that many Allied commanders had little idea what was coming. The Ardennes sector was considered relatively quiet compared to other parts of the front. American units stationed there believed they were occupying a defensive area where major fighting was unlikely. Then, in the early hours of December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered. At around 5:30 in the morning, hundreds of German artillery guns opened fire across a wide stretch of the front. Shells crashed into American positions, communication lines were cut, and confusion spread rapidly through the thin defensive lines. Under the cover of darkness and thick winter fog, German infantry and armored units began moving forward. The offensive had begun. Massive German formations pushed westward through the forests. Panzer divisions rolled down icy roads, while infantry units advanced through snow-covered terrain. The initial shock was enormous. In several areas, American defensive positions were overrun or forced to retreat. German commanders believed their gamble was working, but the offensive depended on something extremely fragile: timing. Every armored column had a schedule. Certain towns had to be captured within specific hours. Bridges needed to be taken intact.
Roads had to remain open for thousands of vehicles moving through the narrow forest routes. If any part of this timetable began to slip, delays would multiply quickly. And right in the middle of this carefully organized plan stood the crossroads at St. Vith. American forces in that sector were commanded by a relatively little-known officer named Bruce C. Clarke. At the time, Clarke was not a famous general. He did not have the reputation of commanders like George Patton, whose bold armored tactics were already legendary among Allied troops. Yet Clarke possessed something that would prove just as important, a clear understanding of terrain and time. As German forces began their attack, American units across the region struggled to understand the scale of what was happening. Reports of enemy tanks, infantry breakthroughs, and disrupted communications flooded headquarters. Some commanders believed the attack might only be a local counteroffensive, but Clarke quickly realized something far more serious was unfolding. The road network around St. Vith made the town a natural defensive position. If American forces could hold the crossroads long enough, they might slow the entire German advance. Even a short delay could disrupt the tight schedule on which the offensive depended. Clarke began organizing a defensive perimeter around the town. Units that had been scattered by the initial assault were regrouped. Reinforcements from armored divisions were moved into position. Artillery batteries were placed where they could cover the key roads leading toward St. Vith. It was not a perfect defense. The American forces were outnumbered, and German armored divisions were pushing forward with tremendous force. But the defense did not need to be perfect. It only needed to hold. As German units approached the crossroads, they expected another quick victory. The early hours of the offensive had already produced several breakthroughs. German commanders believed the American line was collapsing across much of the front. But near St. Vith, something unexpected was happening. Instead of retreating immediately, American defenders dug in. Tanks positioned themselves along narrow roads where German vehicles would have difficulty maneuvering. Artillery observers watched the tree lines, ready to call down fire on enemy columns. The crossroads that German planners had expected to capture quickly was turning into a stubborn defensive position. And with every passing hour, the clock of the German offensive kept ticking. German officers watching their operational maps began to notice something troubling. Units scheduled to pass through St. Vith were being delayed. Traffic began to build along forest roads as armored vehicles waited for the route ahead to clear. In a campaign where speed was everything, even a few hours could change the outcome. The German gamble depended on surprise, momentum, and perfect coordination. But the moment American forces decided not to collapse at St. Vith, the carefully planned timetable of the entire offensive began to slip. And the generals who expected a rapid breakthrough were about to discover that one small crossroads, defended by determined soldiers and led by an unknown American general, could quietly begin to disrupt the last great offensive of Nazi Germany.
When German planners studied the maps for their winter offensive in 1944, they were not only looking at enemy positions, they were studying roads. In the rugged hills and dense forests of the Ardennes, roads determined everything. Armored divisions could not simply drive across fields or forests in winter. Tanks, supply trucks, artillery, and fuel convoys all had to move along a limited network of narrow roads that twisted through valleys and small towns. Whoever controlled those roads controlled the speed of the entire offensive. Among the most important of these locations was a small Belgian town that many people outside the region had never heard of. The town was St. Vith. It was not large, and it did not have the kind of symbolic importance that famous cities carried. But geographically, it sat at the center of a critical road junction. Several major routes connecting eastern Belgium and Luxembourg passed directly through the town. For German armored units pushing westward, these roads were essential. German operational plans assumed that St. Vith would be captured quickly. According to the timetable prepared by commanders such as Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt, German forces would break through the American front line, move rapidly across the Ardennes, and seize the town within the early phase of the offensive.
Once St. Vith was secured, armored columns could continue west toward the Meuse River without major delays. The plan looked efficient on paper. German intelligence believed the American forces in this sector were relatively weak. Several divisions stationed in the Ardennes were inexperienced or recovering from earlier battles. The area had been considered a quiet part of the front where units could rest and reorganize. Because of this, German planners assumed that resistance around St. Vith would collapse quickly under pressure from their advancing Panzer divisions. But reality on the ground was more complicated. American units stationed in the region had spent weeks studying the terrain. Officers understood that even though the Ardennes looked quiet, the road network made certain locations extremely important. If an enemy offensive ever came through the forest, those crossroads would become critical defensive points. The responsibility for defending the area around St. Vith eventually fell under the command of Bruce C. Clarke. Clarke was not widely known at the time. He did not have the dramatic reputation of some of the more famous American generals of the war. Yet within the army, he had a reputation for calm leadership and careful planning. He understood both the strengths and the limitations of the forces under his command. Clarke also understood something else that many commanders in wartime eventually learn. Geography can decide battles long before the shooting begins. The crossroads at St. Vith gave American defenders a rare advantage in the middle of a surprise attack. The surrounding terrain was difficult, filled with forests, hills, and narrow approaches. If properly defended, these natural features could slow a much larger attacking force. But preparing a defense in the middle of a sudden offensive was far from simple. When the German attack began on December 16, 1944, chaos spread across large sections of the front. Artillery bombardments destroyed communication lines. Units that had been resting suddenly found themselves under attack by German infantry and tanks emerging from fog and snow-covered forests. Reports coming into headquarters were often incomplete or confusing. Some messages described enemy breakthroughs, others reported isolated battles with German patrols. In the early hours, it was difficult to determine the full scale of the offensive that had just begun. Yet Clarke began piecing together the situation quickly. The roads leading towards St. Vith were already becoming crowded with retreating American units, damaged vehicles, and reinforcements attempting to move forward. If the Germans captured the crossroads quickly, their armored columns would gain a clear route deeper into Belgium. But if the crossroads could be held, even temporarily, the German advance might be slowed. Clarke began organizing a defensive line around the town. Elements of the 7th Armored Division, along with other American units in the region, were moved into position to strengthen the defense. Tanks were placed where they could cover the key road approaches. Infantry units established defensive positions along the surrounding hills and forests. Artillery units were especially important. In the dense terrain of the Ardennes, artillery could strike advancing enemy columns long before they reached defensive lines. If German tanks attempted to force their way through the roads leading to St. Vith, they would face concentrated fire. Still, the situation remained extremely dangerous. German forces attacking through the Ardennes included several experienced Panzer divisions. These units had fought across Europe and were equipped with powerful tanks and armored vehicles. Many of their commanders believed the American defenders would not hold for long. As German columns pushed westward, their expectations remained high. Early successes in other sectors of the front reinforced the belief that the offensive was progressing according to plan. But the closer German forces moved towards St. Vith, the more complicated the situation became. American resistance in the region was stronger than expected. Defensive positions slowed the advance. Destroyed vehicles and damaged bridges created obstacles along narrow forest roads. Each delay forced German commanders to adjust their movement schedules. At first, these delays seemed minor. Yet in an operation where thousands of vehicles depended on the same road network, even small disruptions could have serious consequences. German armored columns were designed to move like a carefully coordinated machine. Infantry cleared the way, engineers repaired roads and bridges, and supply trucks followed close behind with fuel and ammunition. But when one part of the system slowed down, everything behind it began to pile up. This was especially dangerous in the Ardennes, where many roads were so narrow that vehicles could not easily pass each other. Traffic jams began forming in unexpected places. Armored vehicles waited behind stalled convoys. Supply trucks struggled to keep up with advancing units. Fuel shortages threatened to slow the offensive even further. All of these problems traced back to the same basic issue. The German timetable was beginning to slip. And at the center of that problem stood the crossroads at St. Vith. For the American defenders under Clarke's command, the goal was not necessarily to achieve a dramatic victory. They understood that the German offensive involved enormous forces. Eventually, the pressure might become too great to hold the town forever. But time itself had become the most valuable weapon on the battlefield. Every hour that St. Vith remained in American hands created new difficulties for the German offensive. Every delay forced armored units to reroute through less efficient roads. Every moment allowed Allied commanders elsewhere along the front to begin reacting to the attack. Meanwhile, German officers studying their operational maps began noticing something troubling. Units scheduled to pass through St. Vith were not arriving on time. Some columns were still fighting their way toward the crossroads. Others were waiting behind traffic jams caused by delayed advances. The carefully planned movement schedule was no longer unfolding as expected. What had been designed as a fast, coordinated strike was slowly turning into a series of delays and bottlenecks. And the small town that German planners had once expected to capture almost immediately was becoming one of the most stubborn obstacles in the entire opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. Without realizing it yet, the German High Command was beginning to face a dangerous truth. Their entire offensive depended on speed, and at the crossroads of St. Vith, time was beginning to slip.
By the morning of December 17, 1944, the situation around St. Vith had become far more dangerous than anyone on the American side had expected just 24 hours earlier. German forces were advancing from multiple directions through the forests and valleys of the Ardennes. Columns of tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry pushed forward along icy roads, confident that the surprise offensive was already breaking the Allied line. For the American soldiers defending the crossroads, the scale of the attack was now impossible to ignore. Reports arriving at headquarters described powerful Panzer divisions approaching from the east and southeast. German artillery fire echoed across the hills surrounding the town. Patrols began encountering enemy units much closer than expected. Yet instead of collapsing, the American defense began to organize itself. At the center of this effort stood Bruce C. Clarke. Clarke understood that the situation demanded quick decisions and constant movement. Rather than trying to defend a single rigid line, he focused on building a flexible defensive network around the town. Small groups of tanks, infantry, and artillery were positioned to block key roads and delay the German advance for as long as possible. Clarke also relied heavily on the mobility of the 7th Armored Division, whose units were arriving to reinforce the area. The division had experience fighting in fast-moving battles, and its tanks could shift positions quickly as the situation changed. The landscape around St. Vith played a major role in the defense. The Ardennes was not an open battlefield where massive armored formations could spread out easily. Instead, the terrain forced vehicles to move through narrow corridors between forests, hills, and villages. This created natural choke points where smaller defending forces could slow much larger attackers. American tank crews positioned their vehicles along road approaches where German columns would have limited room to maneuver. Infantry units dug defensive positions in wooded areas overlooking the routes leading toward the town.
Artillery batteries waited behind the lines, ready to fire at enemy vehicles the moment they were spotted. Soon, the first serious clashes began. German armored units approaching the area expected to push through quickly. Instead, they encountered sudden bursts of resistance. American tanks opened fire from concealed positions. Artillery shells crashed into German columns moving along narrow roads. Infantry squads attacked from forest cover, forcing German troops to slow down and deploy before continuing their advance. These actions did not destroy entire German divisions, but they achieved something equally important. They forced the attackers to stop, regroup, and fight for ground that had been expected to fall almost immediately. For German commanders operating under strict timetables, this was a serious problem. The entire offensive depended on rapid movement through the Ardennes road network. Panzer divisions were supposed to keep moving westward almost without pause. But every firefight around St. Vith created new delays. German vehicles damaged on narrow roads blocked traffic behind them. Engineers were forced to clear obstacles and repair damaged routes before columns could continue moving. Units that were supposed to advance together became separated. In some areas, German commanders ordered additional forces forward in an attempt to break through the American defense more quickly. Yet this often created even greater congestion along the roads leading toward the battlefield. Meanwhile, Clarke continued adjusting the American defense. Rather than holding every position until it was destroyed, American units often fought delaying actions before pulling back to new defensive lines. Tanks would fire on approaching German vehicles and then reposition before being surrounded. Infantry units used the forests to withdraw and reappear at new locations along the road network. This style of defense created the impression that American forces were stronger than they actually were. German commanders began encountering resistance in multiple locations at once. Instead of facing a single defensive line, they were forced to deal with a series of obstacles spread across the terrain. The fighting grew more intense as the day progressed. German artillery and tanks pounded American positions around St. Vith. The sound of explosions echoed across the snow-covered hills. Smoke rose above forests where vehicles had been hit along the roads. Yet the crossroads remained in American hands. For the soldiers defending the town, the battle often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Communication lines were frequently cut by shell fire. Units sometimes fought without clear information about what was happening just a few miles away. Still, the overall defensive effort continued working. Every hour that St. Vith remained under American control forced German forces to adjust their plans. Panzer divisions that were supposed to pass through the crossroads now found themselves stuck in slow, grinding battles. German officers studying their operational maps began to notice the consequences. Units scheduled to reach the Meuse River within a specific time frame were already falling behind schedule. Traffic congestion along the Ardennes roads grew worse as additional armored columns attempted to move forward. Even worse, fuel consumption increased as vehicles spent hours idling in long lines of stalled traffic. In the cold winter conditions of the Ardennes, these delays became more than just an inconvenience. They threatened the entire rhythm of the offensive. For Clarke and the American defenders, the goal remained simple. They did not need to destroy the German army. They only needed to keep slowing it down. Throughout December 17th and into the following days, the fighting around St. Vith continued with relentless intensity. German forces attacked from multiple directions, attempting to encircle the town and crush the American defense. Gradually, the pressure on the defenders increased. German units began pushing around the flanks of the American positions. The danger of encirclement grew as additional Panzer formations entered the battle. Supply lines into St. Vith became increasingly difficult to maintain. Clarke and his officers knew the situation could not last forever. Yet the defense had already achieved something extremely important. By holding the crossroads far longer than German planners had expected, American forces had disrupted the timetable of the entire offensive. The delays spreading across the Ardennes were beginning to affect operations far beyond the immediate battlefield. Elsewhere along the front, Allied commanders were starting to react to the German attack. Reinforcements were moving toward threatened sectors. Defensive lines were being reorganized. The surprise that Germany had counted on was slowly fading, and much of that lost time traced back to a stubborn defense at a small Belgian crossroads where American soldiers refused to retreat according to the enemy's schedule. German commanders had expected St. Vith to fall quickly. Instead, it had become one of the most difficult obstacles in the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. And with every passing hour, the cost of that unexpected resistance continued to grow.
By the third and fourth days of the offensive, something was beginning to worry the German high command. On the surface, the attack through the Ardennes still looked powerful. Large German formations were advancing. American units had been forced to retreat in several areas, and the front line had bulged westward deep into Allied territory. This expanding bulge in the line would later give the battle its famous name, the Battle of the Bulge. But behind the front lines, German staff officers studying operational maps began noticing troubling signs. The timetable was slipping. When the offensive had been planned weeks earlier, every major unit had been assigned a specific schedule. Panzer divisions were expected to pass through certain towns on precise dates and hours. Engineers were supposed to clear obstacles and secure bridges quickly so that supply convoys could follow the armored spearheads. Speed was the foundation of the entire operation. If the German columns could move rapidly enough, they might reach the Meuse River before the Allies had time to organize a strong defense. If they crossed the river and pushed toward Antwerp, the entire Allied position in Western Europe could be thrown into chaos. But behind the front lines, German staff officers studying operational maps began noticing troubling signs. The timetable was slipping. When the offensive had been planned weeks earlier, every major unit had been assigned a specific schedule. Panzer divisions were expected to pass through certain towns on precise dates and hours. Engineers were supposed to clear obstacles and secure bridges quickly so that supply convoys could follow the armored spearheads. Speed was the foundation of the entire operation. If the German columns could move rapidly enough, they might reach the Meuse River before the Allies had time to organize a strong defense. If they crossed the river and pushed toward Antwerp, the entire Allied position in Western Europe could be thrown into chaos. But now, reports arriving at headquarters suggested that things were not unfolding as planned. Several armored units that should have been far to the west were still struggling to move through the eastern Ardennes. Long columns of vehicles were stuck on narrow forest roads. Fuel trucks were falling behind schedule. Engineers were being forced to repair damaged bridges and clear blocked routes. Again and again, one location kept appearing in the reports: the crossroads town of St. Vith. For German commanders such as Walter Model, who had been placed in charge of the overall defensive and offensive operations on the Western Front, the situation was becoming increasingly frustrating. Model was known for his ability to stabilize difficult situations, but even he understood that the success of this operation depended on something extremely fragile: momentum. If the offensive slowed too much, Allied forces would have time to respond. Fresh American divisions could be moved into the path of the German advance. Air power, temporarily grounded by winter weather, could eventually return once the skies cleared. Every hour mattered. Yet the resistance around St. Vith had already created delays that German planners had not expected.
Instead of quickly capturing the crossroads and continuing west, several German divisions had been forced into prolonged fighting. Roads that should have been open were now blocked by damaged vehicles, destroyed equipment, and traffic jams stretching for miles through the forests. Panzer commanders found themselves facing a frustrating reality. Their tanks were powerful, but they could only move as fast as the road network allowed. When hundreds of vehicles tried to use the same narrow routes at once, even a small obstacle could create enormous congestion. Some German units attempted to bypass the stubborn American defense around St. Vith by using alternate routes, but the Ardennes terrain made this extremely difficult. Many secondary roads were too narrow or poorly maintained to handle large armored columns. In several places, vehicles slid off icy roads into ditches. Supply trucks struggled to reach forward units. Fuel shortages began appearing earlier than expected. Meanwhile, the American defenders under Bruce C. Clarke continued their stubborn resistance. Clarke understood that the town itself was important, but the larger goal was still time. His forces continued fighting delaying actions around the crossroads, forcing German units to deploy and fight rather than simply driving past the town. American artillery played a critical role in this phase of the battle. Forward observers positioned on hills and in forest clearings watched for German movement along the roads. When enemy columns were spotted, artillery batteries opened fire, sending shells crashing into vehicles packed tightly along narrow routes. Even when these attacks did not destroy large numbers of vehicles, they forced German commanders to halt and reorganize their columns. Every pause added more delay. Inside German command posts, staff officers began recalculating the progress of the offensive. Some units that had been expected to advance dozens of miles were still fighting in the eastern Ardennes. Others were struggling with fuel shortages caused by the slow movement of supply convoys. The carefully designed timetable of the offensive was beginning to fall apart. For commanders like Gerd von Rundstedt, the situation created a growing sense of urgency. Rundstedt had originally expressed doubts about the ambitious plan to strike through the Ardennes. Now the early delays seemed to confirm many of his concerns. Yet stopping the offensive was not an option. The German army had committed enormous resources to the attack. Several of the last available Panzer divisions had been thrown into the operation. Germany no longer had the strength to launch many more large offensives on the Western Front. This was supposed to be the decisive gamble. And yet, the deeper German forces pushed into the Ardennes, the more complicated the situation became. While German columns struggled with traffic jams and stubborn resistance, Allied commanders were beginning to react. Information about the scale of the offensive was slowly reaching higher headquarters. Reinforcements were being organized and moved toward threatened areas. Most importantly, time was allowing the Allies to stabilize their defenses. In the opening hours of the offensive, surprise was Germany's greatest advantage. American units had been caught off guard by the sudden attack. Confusion and disorganization had allowed German forces to achieve several early breakthroughs. But as the days passed, that advantage was fading. Defensive lines were forming, reinforcements were arriving, commanders were gaining a clearer picture of where the German spearheads were moving. And much of this change had been made possible because the offensive had not moved as quickly as planned. The stubborn defense at St. Vith had forced German forces to fight longer and harder for ground that had been expected to fall almost immediately. Eventually, American forces would be forced to withdraw from the town as the pressure from surrounding German units increased. But by the time that withdrawal happened, the damage to the German timetable had already been done. What German planners had expected to be a rapid breakthrough had instead turned into a slower and far more difficult advance. The offensive was still dangerous. German forces had pushed deep into Allied territory, creating a massive bulge in the front line. But the speed required to achieve the most ambitious goals of the operation was already slipping away.
And inside German headquarters, commanders studying their maps were beginning to understand a troubling reality. A small crossroads town in Belgium, defended by determined American soldiers and led by an officer few German generals had even heard of before the battle, had already begun to disrupt the carefully planned schedule of Germany's final great offensive in the West.
By the time December 19 and 20 arrived, the situation around St. Vith had already made a lasting impact on the Ardennes offensive. German forces continued to push forward with determination, but the delays caused by the stubborn American defense were now echoing across the entire front. Armored columns that had been expected to reach the Meuse River were still miles behind schedule, while supply trucks struggled to keep pace with advancing tanks. Every hour the crossroads remained under American control added to the disruption of Germany's ambitious plan. Elsewhere, Allied commanders were beginning to respond with increasing coordination. Units that had been held in reserve or positioned elsewhere along the front were redeployed to threatened sectors. Fresh divisions began moving into place, and artillery positions were reinforced to counter German movements. The delay at St. Vith had not only slowed the panzers, but had bought critical time for the Allies to strengthen their overall defensive posture. The defense of St. Vith had been costly. American forces suffered casualties, and buildings along the main streets were damaged or destroyed by artillery and tank fire. Supply lines were stretched, and soldiers endured bitter cold, snow, and constant pressure from German attacks. Yet these hardships were outweighed by the strategic value of the delay. Each hour gained by the defense made it more difficult for German commanders to maintain the tightly controlled timetable their entire offensive depended upon. Meanwhile, German officers such as Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt faced increasing frustration. Their carefully designed schedules were unraveling. Traffic jams on narrow Ardennes roads worsened as armored columns became stuck behind stalled units. Fuel shortages became more pronounced because trucks carrying essential supplies could not reach the front lines on time. Even when new routes were attempted, terrain and weather created obstacles that slowed progress. The small Belgian town had achieved something remarkable. By holding the crossroads for days longer than the Germans expected, American forces under Bruce C. Clarke had forced the enemy to operate under a new, more chaotic set of circumstances. The initial momentum of Hitler's offensive was blunted, and the window of opportunity for a rapid advance towards Antwerp began to close. As the battle around St. Vith drew on, attention elsewhere turned to other key locations, most famously Bastogne. There, American defenders also held against overwhelming odds. But while Bastogne became a symbol of heroism in the public eye, the quiet, stubborn defense of St. Vith had already played a critical role in shaping the course of the entire offensive. The two battles together slowed the German advance, disrupted communications, and created confusion among armored divisions attempting to maintain a tight schedule. Eventually, American forces did withdraw from St. Vith, leaving behind a battlefield scarred by shell fire and tank tracks. Yet the strategic effect of the defense remained. The Germans had been forced to move slower than planned, allowing the Allies to organize counterattacks, reposition reserves, and prepare for subsequent operations that would ultimately reverse the gains of the offensive. Historians later noted that the battle for St. Vith demonstrated an essential principle of modern warfare. Time can be as decisive a weapon as firepower. Control over key terrain, when paired with disciplined, determined defense, can disrupt an enemy's most ambitious plans. Clarke's leadership and the perseverance of his troops showed that even a small force, correctly positioned and coordinated, could create delays with far-reaching consequences. The Ardennes offensive continued for weeks, producing dramatic fighting, heavy casualties, and heroic stands across the front.
Yet the events around St. Vith exemplified how a seemingly modest crossroads, defended by determined soldiers, could quietly shape the outcome of one of the largest and most dangerous German operations of the war. By holding that town longer than the Germans expected, American forces under Bruce C. Clarke had forced the enemy to operate under a new, more chaotic set of circumstances. The initial momentum of Hitler's offensive was blunted, and the window of opportunity for a rapid advance towards Antwerp began to close. In the end, the stubborn defense at St. Vith was a lesson in the power of timing, terrain, and leadership. It reminded commanders on both sides that in war, speed and momentum are fragile, and even a small, determined force can alter the course of history by simply refusing to yield.